4. The women's privilege of not being held accountable. On the one hand, one cannot talk about emancipation, and on the other hand, not hold accountable people we consider emancipated at the risk of committing a contradiction. As the Enlightenment, and more generally the whole modernity, taught us, a person can only be considered emancipated if they are responsible and, as such, held accountable for what they do and say. Because if a person is not responsible and simultaneously not held accountable, either for what they do or say, or for what they do not do or say, when they are supposed to do or say something, then that person cannot be considered emancipated. Not only we cannot hold accountable someone who is not emancipated, and for that reason, we attribute as a rule to the parents the responsibility for what minors do or say, we also cannot absolve someone who is, or someone we consider to be, emancipated. Emancipation and responsibility are closely interconnected. The question of the emancipation only arises if the question of the accountability is raised, and vice versa. Now, if women and, above all, feminists, but also the left-wing parties, the media, universities, and the judicial system, talk about women's emancipation, while at the same time absolving women of responsibility for their dreadful behavior, especially their failures and their reprehensible behaviors, seeking scapegoats for this effect, whether it be the patriarchy, the structural sexism, or the toxic masculinity, etc. What they are doing is subliminally asserting, without, however, publicly and categorically admitting it, that the project of women's emancipation is a big fraud. But this immorality that absolves women from their responsibility is carried out, attention, only when it comes to their failures and to their reprehensible behavior. Because when it does not come to their failures and to their reprehensible behavior, the same people who absolve them of responsibility, seeking scapegoats for this purpose, in this case, already attribute the authorship of this circumstantial success to women, without needing to seek to hold third parties responsible for the success that they now attribute only to women. When reality neither confirms nor reinforces the women's deification narrative, are applied systemic analyses in order to absolve the part, that is, women, of responsibility and hold the whole accountable, which serves simultaneously as an opportunity to attack men for considering them the creators of the whole. At the same time, when reality confirms and reinforces the women's deification narrative, now the part is held responsible for what it has done, without the need to hold the whole responsible for its success. But it is in this unequal scheme of punishments and rewards that women, by being placed in the large group of the oppressed, acquire this privilege. Everything they do that is ethically reprehensible or professionally dreadful is not held accountable, holding accountable those who are the daily victims of their endemic toxicity. And the legitimate question that arises is, how is it possible to attribute this privilege of absolving women of responsibility for their toxic behavior, especially when the topic of equality between men and women presupposes the idea of equal rights, recognized for both, without the existence of privileges, just as the idea of women's emancipation presupposes the idea of their accountability, and not their exemption from responsibility and consequent infantilization and mediocritization. There are three main reasons for this. The first has already been mentioned before and has historical and ideological connotations, based on resentment toward the past and the understanding of the concept of historical justice as revenge against tradition and its perpetrators, the so-called white men. The second reason has clearly a sexist connotation on the part of women themselves, who in general, and feminists in particular, consider the male sex to be inferior compared to the female sex, and therefore unofficially defended the idea that women should have rights and privileges, while men should still be deprived of many of their rights they have deservedly achieved. The third reason has a political connotation and is linked to a question of power on the part of those who see men as a threat to corrupt elites due to the hormonal and physical characteristics that defines them. That is, due to their testosterone and strength, a threat that women do not represent, due to the same hormonal and physical characteristics that defines them. That is, the absence of testosterone and strength, that the reversal of the elements of masculinity and femininity in men and women today will never be enough for this threat now to come from them. These are the three reasons why the toxic behavior of women today in our Western societies is not properly held accountable. And it's for these same reasons that today we combat publicly what is called toxic masculinity and do not combat, by the same criterion, toxic femininity, which today is even more prevalent than masculine toxicity. In the same way that we combat the famous domestic violence against women and do not combat domestic violence practiced by women against men, their partners, or by mothers against their sons and daughters, which we believe to be much more frequent than that practiced by men against women. In the same way, and for the same reasons, that we hear more often people talking about the Oedipus complex without ever mentioning the Electra complex, with the purpose of denigrating the image of men in our societies, as if they were all sexually perverted individuals, while protecting and whitewashing the sexually depraved side of women. In the same way, and for the same reasons already mentioned, that the Oedipus mother complex is whitewashed, when it is responsible for the problems that so often leads to family conflicts, especially between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, their sons' partners, because many mothers have libidinous interests in their sons, and as a result, they create toxic relationships of competitiveness between them and their daughters-in-law, and this phenomenon being so often at the base of the collapse of so many families. In the same way, and for the same reasons, that we do not combat the bad environments within the neighborhoods, caused mainly by the gossipy and intrusive behavior of our female neighbors, who do nothing else in life but generate situations of conflict with their neighbors, many times due to the gratuitous policing of their neighbors' lives. In the same way, and for the same reasons, that we do not combat the bad environments in the workplace, here too, mostly caused by the toxic and scheming behavior of women, sometimes against other women, sometimes against men, and in this particular case, for reasons that led Sigmund Freud to nickname what motivates them to do that as penis envy, etc. And all of this for historical and ideological reasons, sexist reasons and political reasons, which absolves women of responsibility and whitewashes their toxic behavior in various spheres of our today's society. Whether for historical and ideological reasons, sexist reasons, or political reasons, the underlying idea is to create this double illusion that women's empowerment is related, on the one hand, to the topic of women's emancipation, that is, to their liberation, when in fact the idea is rather to grant them this power in order to use them. And in using them, the aim is not to liberate them, but to control them, with the intention, on the other hand, of using them to domesticate men, a purpose hidden behind the illusion that the other purpose of women's empowerment is simply the equality between them and men.